Welcome to Thrivable Studio, where patient experience is more than just a buzzword. Today, we're talking about preventing fraud in research, with some experts estimating that up to 30% of research data is fraudulent. The risks to insights, budgets, and reputations are real. This is why we've decided to call upon two of Thrivable's in-house research experts, Maria Muccioli and Brian Lee, to break down how to stop fraud before it starts, detect it during research, and clean it up afterward. With that, let's chat. Welcome to the studio, Maria and Brian.
Adam, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Adam.
Before we dive into the real meat of this subject, I want to start with a question to both ground us and provide a valuable takeaway for those listening or watching who may not have enough time to get through this entire episode. So, as we're talking about fraud, what I want to understand, what's the number one mistake researchers make when trying to combat fraud in market research studies?
That's a great question. I really think it comes down to something so simple but so important, and that's really just not taking the time to think through everything to optimize your setup. So that can include thinking through the types of potential flags to introduce in your survey design, or it can be an overarching view of how you manage a panel of research respondents. I think at the heart of it, you really just need to understand your population, what might make sense and what might not make sense in terms of certain attributes they would have or the way that they would behave when taking a survey. Something a little bit more rare to pay attention to might be nonsensical answer combinations. And that could be something as simple as a height and weight that don't make sense together or are so outside of the realm of possibility. So tagging combinations of responses that just don't make sense together. There's also the evaluation of body open ends, and then at the heart of it is the sourcing of your participants. So altogether, it's all incredibly important, and therefore I think the number one mistake is just not considering how all those things come together and could really affect your project if not thought about on a holistic level.
Brian, anything you'd like to add to that?
So along the lines of what Maria said, not taking enough time to optimize the setup, I think a lot of times we might be very tempted as researchers to rely on the standard settings that we're accustomed to. It's sort of like a set it and forget it mentality, meaning that like a single fraud prevention measure or a single set of measures can offer full protection. But in short, fraud prevention is an ongoing process, and it relies on multiple layers, staying vigilant, as well as continuously iterating in order to stay ahead of the bad actors.
Thank you. Let's take a step back here. So when we say fraud in research, what do we actually mean? And what are some of the most common forms of fraud that both of y'all have seen in your experience?
Yeah, so fraud can usually be put into two general categories: ineligibility as well as poor response quality. For ineligibility, this can be falsifying information about yourself to pass screening requirements, as well as having multiple accounts or making multiple submissions in order to collect more incentives. A common example of this would be like bots that are set up to submit a huge number of responses on a survey. And then the other category, poor response quality, would be things like speeding, basically just clicking through very quickly, not actually engaging in the activity, straightlining, it's basically selecting all the same choices throughout the whole activity, and as Maria mentioned, illogical or nonsensical answers. And usually what we commonly see with this type of fraud is that it's a combination of all the above.
And then what do you see is driving people to commit fraud in research? I mean, I have my thoughts and reasons as to probably why, but just want to really understand what those most common motivations or enablers are.
The bottom line for me is it's probably the money, the incentive.
I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, so as Maria said, it usually comes back to the financial incentive. The thing is with this type of fraud, it's kind of an area where there's like a low barrier to entry, as well as a low risk of real world consequences. And what I mean by that is that anyone is able to express interest in research opportunities, especially when we're talking about online research. And in most cases, if they're caught, there's not that much that really happens outside of their account getting flagged and removed. And on the flip side, there's the potential to collect a large amount of research incentives, especially if someone successfully submits hundreds or thousands of fraudulent survey responses. And I think the scary part of this is that this happens all the time. So that's why it's important that we all take fraud prevention seriously, so that it's never seen as an easy opportunity in the eyes of these bad actors.
Do you see any higher percentage of fraud take place the higher the incentive is for the study?
Not necessarily. I've seen it all different ways, because you could have multiple accounts entering in a $5 activity. You could easily rack up $500 depending on what your fraud methodologies specifically that you're using are. I mean, whether you're using some kind of system to auto send a bunch of different invitations from different addresses and just complete them at random, whether folks are entering and manually clicking through a bunch of times from maybe different devices. But to secure a much larger incentive, that usually entails different types of research activities, such as interviews, whether they're in person or online. So for the most part, whether you're a bad actor or a bot, you're probably not going to want to sign up for one of those.
And then, Maria, can you share maybe a quick example of a time that you've both caught fraudulent data and what was the impact to that?
Yeah, definitely. One theme that always stands out, and maybe this won't come as a surprise, is looking at rare populations. Let me give an example of what a rare population might be. For instance, a brand new piece of technology just came out on the market, and a research group might be looking to speak to them. Now, if the product is brand new on the market, by definition, that warrants that probably not that many folks have adopted, used it. But we do need to find these people and get their insights. So sometimes, though, finding those needles in the haystack can be challenging in that by nature of being such a rare population, they are more prone to fraud. And that could be for several reasons. It could be just to somebody misclicking that they use a particular product by accident, or it could be somebody selecting that on purpose but not being genuine about it because they recognize that this is a new product and this is probably what they're looking for me to get compensated. So that's something that's really always been critical to pay attention to when you're going into recruiting for a rare population. It's incredibly important to slow down even more and make sure that you carefully think through, how do we vet that these participants are authentic. A particular example that comes to mind, we were recruiting for users of a particular health application. It wasn't very, very common. And I remember finding that a large proportion of those folks, once we actually got in touch with them, said, "Oh, no, I made a mistake. I don't use this." Or we found out that they were being disingenuous. We did find some authentic users, which was great and super important to get those insights, but we just had to tell our customer, hey, they just don't exist at this volume yet to be able to fill the study to your specifications of sample size, but this is what we can provide. And not only can we provide that, but we can guarantee their authenticity because we've taken these extra steps to vet them extra carefully.
Brian, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have another quick example that comes to mind where one time we had a rather large wave of fraudulent responses on a particular survey that we were running. And it took us quite a bit of time to go through and flag them all. But after that, we took those responses as well as the profiles of those respondents, and we used that information in order to identify similarities and trends, which were then used to improve upon fraud detection that we have built into our panel. So in summary, even in those bad situations, there might be something that you can learn or take away to make things better moving forward.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about fraud and what fraud is, the motivating factors to look for, and what may be driving people to commit fraud. I want to now dive into the real meat of this, which is how to actually prevent fraud. So I'm excited to have you two here today to explain maybe some of the methods you guys use to combat fraud, because I think everybody is dealing with it in some capacity. So let's start with the managed panel side of this thing. So for those folks who are managing a panel out there, what does a proactive approach to fraud prevention look like before a study even launches if you do manage your own panel?
I can talk a little bit about how we've approached it. There are a lot of potential solutions that are already on the market. For instance, we use a partner called Xeon. They run the parameters like IP address, geolocation, social media profile information, attributes like that to flag potentially fraudulent accounts. So that's the first layer, because that's something that's generic enough where it can apply to everybody. But I found that second layer of understanding that audience to have more custom fraud flags built in on top of that to be really key to having that multi-pronged approach to, okay, we've passed them through this validated system where we think they're probably real people.
And would you say that those custom layers or custom flags, are those something you've come up with as the lead in terms of what rival needs to succeed, or are they generic enough that people could put them together no matter, if they're managing their own panel?
Yeah, so for us, we work in healthcare, so we approach it from a therapy's perspective, where we know that if somebody has X health condition, they're very unlikely to have been prescribed this class of drugs or this combination of drugs. So when we notice those things, and maybe on its own it doesn't stand out as much, it could have just been one misclick or, an error in reporting. But if you layer enough of those on each other, you can almost come up with a custom score depending on what your population looks like. And then you have to work really carefully to figure out, where is that threshold of where we consider this is likely enough fraud that they need to be removed from participation.
And whether it's a question for you or for Brian, but kind of what are there additional tools that we are using or technologies that exist out there, maybe that we're even not using to add that second layer, or are those all in-house built?
One of the first measures that we will always apply to like a study that we run will be a CAPTCHA. So whether that's survey that we send out, screener, will always have some layer of CAPTCHA. Basically, it's a test that someone has to pass. You've probably seen it before, a checkbox that says, I am a human. There's also a version that runs in the background, so that's completely without user interaction. This is going to return a value for how likely someone is a bot. In our experience, it's not always a good idea to completely terminate a respondent solely based on a score because false positives do happen, but it is important that you capture and record this value. This makes it so that it's easier afterwards for you to filter that list and identify the high risk respondents, so then you can conduct a further review. And in our experience, this has worked pretty well for flagging bots, but obviously the main limitation is that it's only for bots. It doesn't do much against fraudulent human responses. So for those types of fraud, we bring in other tools such as IP tracking, digital fingerprinting. For example, if we see a group of respondents having the exact same IP address as well as the exact same device specifications, right? Like that might be operating system, screen resolution, browser type, then we can quickly flag them for further review. And then very importantly, we almost always send out survey invites using a unique single-use link. This means that we know exactly who we sent it to, and if a suspicious response comes in, we have a profile that we can refer to when we're doing our review. Otherwise, if we're distributing public reusable links, I can only imagine the headache of having to deal with a large amount of fraud that you have no idea where it came from.
This seems like a very robust and thorough system or process. Is this something that you can kind of spin up quickly, or Maria, is this something that over your time at Thrive you've just layered upon through learning and realizing where there's gaps? How do you build something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. It does take a village, and we have learned so much over the years, and we've come so far. Our product team works so closely with both Xeon and with us to make sure that our Xeon settings are really optimized for us, and they've done so much work to make sure that they understand how we think on the research side and how the technology people on the Xeon side think, to kind of really bring together the most win-win solution in terms of not excluding too many real folks by nature of the design, but also by making sure that we're really robust in our bot prevention. And it has definitely taken several iterations over the years, and we're constantly also adjusting based on our learnings. There is a bit of a human element I wanted to touch base on, and that's, our recruiting team. And sometimes when you're speaking to a person on the phone or even by email communications, the team is really good at picking up on very subtle nuances that we have, again, learned over time, and because of our in-depth healthcare knowledge, that something's not right here. Especially if you're going to be recruiting for a study that's super high stakes. I'm talking sending people for studies that are for FDA submission of important medical products. And again, people's health is at stake here. So for us, quality has to be at the very top of our processes, because we understand the impacts downstream, right, that this could have. This sending a false participant to a large research study in person because they were brazen enough to do something like that. We cannot have that happen, because it would cost people thousands of dollars. And what if they make it through the study somehow? Then you're having the insights of somebody who is completely not fit to give the appropriate insights for product development in the healthcare space. And that's just so important to us to make sure that nothing like that ever happens. And so our recruiting team is really, really great at kind of making sure that they are aware of the subtle nuances of what could be considered a red flag when you are in a one-on-one interaction with someone like that.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's like a technology layer that kind of is the initial filtering, and then that human layer is like the final threshold. And if you can get through that, then we've kind of vetted you fully to say this is a quality participant.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes multiple steps and definitely learning from every experience, every interaction every day.
So we touched on a little bit of everything there, but it was tailored around managing your own panel. So there's a lot of researchers who are not managing their own panel and using third-party panels to do their research. What are the most important steps researchers can take when working with third-party panels?
For me, understanding how that particular panel provider recruits their panelists, what kind of information they collect from them, and how do they validate their authenticity. That's kind of at the heart of it for me. But Brian, do you have anything to add, especially on the tech side?
Yeah, as many layers of fraud prevention measures that you have just to enable those, because you can never have too many.
So if I'm calling up a vendor, are there a couple questions or thoughts that you would suggest they ask at the top?
Yeah, I am always very curious to know exactly what points of information, what data points they collect when folks are invited to participate. And then again, what steps do they take to make sure that a participant who is completing a research activity is authentic?
We were talking about what to look for when leveraging a third party vendor for recruitment and the upfront work that you need to do to ensure that vendor can deliver quality patients. But after that study wraps, what are some key checks or data cleaning methods that you recommend doing? And do they change whether or not you're using a third party panel or an in house managed panel?
Usually, when we design our activities, we definitely think upfront about what are the potential flags, and we try and go ahead and label those responses with those flags as they come in. We don't necessarily exclude everybody as part of the activity, depending on how much weight we're giving each of those flags. And then that upfront fraud prevention design would dictate a lot of the data cleaning or remove the need for data cleaning. Then again, you have to pay attention to a kind of a different type of data quality issue, and that's something like speeders, straight liners, having gibberish in the open ends. It's interesting about the speeders, though. One thing I found over time, there really are some people who are much faster readers, and it can be unfair to exclude them simply because they're faster. One way to circumvent this is to add some hidden items to longer choices. What I mean is there could be a quick multi-select question that it's feasible that somebody who is a quick reader might read it quickly and answer within just a few seconds. But if there are questions that are really kind of large, have a lot of introductory text that's important to read, or a long matrix question, I would recommend adding timers also to those specific questions. So not having a metric of just speed across the entire activity, but basically understanding, did this person slow down enough at those key questions? So, for instance, if a respondent landed in the top fifth percentile for speed overall, but slowed down proportionately with the rest of the respondents on some of those key items, that definitely would have required some pause and review. Their likelihood of having provided thoughtful feedback is considerably higher than those who exhibit speeding, not only overall, but also speeding through those key elements.
So I want to talk about what teams can do starting tomorrow to maybe change some of their practices. From Brian's end, want to lead with you here. Is there one myth about fraud prevention that you would love to debunk?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is thinking that any one fraud prevention measure can totally eliminate fraud. In reality, there's never a single foolproof solution, and fraudsters will constantly adapt and find workarounds. So it's very, very important for researchers everywhere to keep this in mind in order to stay one step ahead. As I think I mentioned earlier, danger in thinking something can be 100% effective is that you might actually open yourself up to more vulnerability. So let's say a workaround is found for security measures that you've implemented, and they're widely shared among fraudsters. Now you're at the risk of having a huge influx of fraud come in. And the most effective fraud prevention will always be multi-layered. And there's always going to be some degree of monitoring and human review, as much as we might not like. The goal of all of this, though, is to force fraudsters to jump through enough hoops so that the cost is just high enough that they simply won't attempt.
Maria, from your end, you lead the research team at Thrivable. How do you collaborate, communicate across the recruitment function of your team, the research function of the team, data science, our case, our product team, to just ensure that our best fraud measures are constantly in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking earlier a little bit about how our product team really serves as the bridge between Theon, our partner in security, and the research team to really bridge the gap in understanding how much of a flag is this healthcare therapeutic combination? How many points, shall we say, should we assign for that? And how do we layer that on top of the existing Theon metrics? But across departments and just in general, I think it's not just a multi-layered approach. It's not just a checklist. It just has to be a mindset, and the mindset has to constantly evolve. The fraud checklist could look different at the same organization depending on the specific activity that you're conducting. So not being too rigid, really taking that mindful, thoughtful, agile approach to the particular thing that you're doing at the time. Just front loading that work to really think through what's data cleaning going to look like here? What kind of additional measures, if any, do we need to take with this population to make sure that our data is as clean as possible? It really pays off in the end because prevention is always best. That's really, really at the heart of it for me.
I love hearing that. Yeah, it's not just a checklist, it's a mindset. It sounds like it's a cultural priority. Probably everybody on board has to really believe that it's priority, because it doesn't sound like just your team alone would be able to manage it the way we're able to, because you have buy-in from everybody within the organization.
Everyone's on the same team and rowing in the same direction. That's definitely key.
And Brian, is there anything you kind of want to end with in terms of what a researcher maybe could do tomorrow to make their studies more fraud resistant? I know you talked a lot about this multi-layer approach, but is there anything very specific you want to end?
Pretty much just echoing what Maria just said. It's mentality, wanting to stay one step ahead of those bad actors, because they are working tirelessly to find workarounds to the security measures that you're implementing. So you're constantly going to have to adapt, and it's a never-ending battle.
Well, Brian, Maria, this has been great. I learned a ton. I hope everybody else listening and watching did as well. Thank you all so much for your time, and continue the great work in combating fraud in research.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Adam.